Hi there, I'm Clint Stout, and I'm a beginning comic writer. I'm just starting out on my journey, trying to break into comics. And with me, I have my co-host, James from Kowabunga Comics.
Hello!
Alright, this is Comics That Work. The goal of this show is basically to explore what makes a good comic. I want to get deep into the details and find out from different perspectives what people like about their favorite comic books. Every episode I'm going to have a different co-host on, so James won't always be with me. But I'm going to have the co-host pick a book of their choice, and we're just going to talk in pretty good detail about it.
Now, this is a book that you've never read, that someone is recommending to you.
That's true. In this case, it is.
Okay.
I read it now.
But in the future, is it allowable for someone to recommend a book that you have read?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Anything. I mean, as long as, you know.
And what are the clearly defined lines of what you could... Like, if I wanted to say, let's read Squadron Supreme, are you going to say a 12-issue maxi series is too much? Or do you have is it defined like that?
I don't really have any clear lines. I'd probably say like a 12-issue maxi might be a little too large of a story to focus on. My original plan was to just do single issues.
And then I ruined it?
Yeah, but I actually think that's good that we're starting with a 4-issue mini like this. I think just like if there's an OGN, like even as big as like Blankets or something like that, or like a 4 or 5 issue miniseries, or just a single issue, or even a manga volume. But I don't really have any set perimeters. I mean, if I don't think that something's going to be good for it, I'll talk with the co-host a little bit about it. Just because, I mean, even something like a 4-issue miniseries, we're gonna have to condense it because we can't talk like issue by issue. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So James, you are one of the owners of Kowabunga Comics in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin.
I sure am.
Yeah, and that's the store I go to. But I'm not.
Hey,
yeah, I don't just have you on because you're my friend and all that. You actually know about comic books.
I know a little bit.
Yeah,
I've been reading comic books for. It's going on well. I just entered the 33 club, so I've been reading comics since I was 5. And that's a good amount of time.
Yeah,
but my knowledge of comics, as we have often discussed, I think if you took what I know and what you know, we could cover about 75 years worth of comics. Although, like, the heavy lifting from the last 20 years is all going to be on you, specifically, like anything recent.
Mm-hmm.
Despite having a store, my knowledge tends to be more. I like Golden Age and Silver and Bronze, and I'm not as familiar with a lot of the current stuff like you are.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar about any of that stuff, so
we're gonna turn that around.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I have the store, and I'm a longtime comic reader. This is not my first time on a podcast. I also have a current podcast called the Cowcast, where we talk about. It is a comic related podcast, but it's more discussing and analyzing industry topics, not necessarily talking about comic content. We kind of steer away from that. We're not talking about characters and specific titles. And I also used to have, with some other guys, we had a video game podcast called Well Versed in the Classics that we started about 8 years ago now. So I've been no stranger to podcasting, but I'm always happy to be on a new one.
Yeah, and thank you for being there.
Yeah, of course.
On here. You were actually a customer at the store when I used to work there.
That's right.
But then I moved out for college for like a semester and then lost my job because yeah.
Well, so when I had first moved to Oconomowoc, it was right after the store had opened, which is 13 years ago now? 13 years ago? Because they opened in...
Probably.
Yeah. 12 years ago.
Something like that.
Anyways, moved to Oconomowoc, and of course I switched over to the comic store that was in town that I could walk to. And I was, I think, the third person to start a pull list there. And
nice.
So I went there for quite a while, and I don't necessarily think I remember you working there when I was there. To be quite honest with you, I feel bad, but
Well, yeah, I was there specific days of the week.
So. There were a lot of at the time there were a lot of different people working there,
mm-hmm.
But yeah, so it's a little bit of a switcheroo right now, but that's kind of cool.
Yeah,
and I still live in Oconomowoc, and we are sitting. We're doing this podcast in my 3 Seasons room, and it is about 94 degrees out right now.
I wouldn't say quite there. But
it is hot and humid though. So
yeah.
We're drinking some beers and brandy in the sunroom, and
that is true.
And about to talk some comics in lovely Oconomowoc.
Yeah, you should come visit if you've never been.
Please do.
It's pretty normal.
You want to get down to brass tacks here?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I just want to talk a little bit more about what kind of comics you are usually into. You mentioned you are more familiar with a lot of older stuff,
mm-hmm.
but
well,
what kind of stuff do you enjoy the most?
Currently, I do read a lot of current books. Walking Dead is one that I've been lucky enough to read since it started coming out.
Okay.
I picked a copy of that and Invincible off the shelf at the same time, and enjoyed that ever since. I kind of fell off Invincible, but I've stayed on Walking Dead. I've always been a fan of horror and survival horror and stories like that.
Yeah.
Consequently, I've also been a big Garth Ennis fan and all of his iterations from Preacher to Hitman to The Boys to Crossed. Just about anything that he's done I've loved. And I think one thing that a lot of people think about Garth Ennis and they think about his bigger stories. They think about Preacher, Preacher was one of the big defining comics, I think, of, I want to say, my childhood. And I guess that probably sounds bad reading Preacher as a child,
yeah.
But Preacher was, I did. Well,
nice.
Because I bought, when the second issue came out, I had been buying Wizard magazine. And Wizard was talking about Preacher being like the hottest book on the market, the craziest book. You'll never read anything like it. And I went into a store in Milwaukee, and I would have been 8 at the time, and they let me buy it right off the shelf. They didn't stop me.
Oh gosh!
So I bought Preacher, and then I read it pretty much every issue after that. I was never able to get a hold of the first issue off the shelf when it originally came out, but I got one a couple of years later. Cool. And Garth Ennis, though, besides that stuff, he's got a lot of great one-shots, miniseries. I think overall my favorite Garth Ennis work is his stuff that is more rooted in history. I'm a big fan of reading. I've always been very interested in reading about military history and reading about World War II and World War I and the Civil War. And I've had relatives that have been in just about every conflict since the Civil War. My grandpa spent 4 years in the Pacific, and so I naturally gravitated towards Garth Ennis's World War II stuff. Yeah. And he writes a lot of it, and he writes, just some of the best written World War. The attention to detail that he has is just incredible. So I've always really appreciated that. And there's kind of 2 Garth Ennises. There's the Garth Ennis that can write stuff like Adventures in the Rifle Brigade, and the more comical Dicks was a series he did for a while with I think through Avatar, and it was published by another company for a while. Yeah. Where it's just kind of goofy, over the top stuff that everybody that a lot of people associate with him. Yeah. But then you have the earnest Garth Ennis, where his stories he's got a lot of heart in them. And that's not to say that the two don't ever intersect, because Preacher would certainly have elements of both of those conflicting. Everything that happened to Hair Star and Arseface, but you also had the relationships between the characters that got pretty messed up and pretty serious, and it was very, very heavy stuff. But the more earnest Garth Ennis stuff has always been my absolute favorite of his. Specifically, the war stories that he did for Vertigo. Now he's doing a war story series for Avatar, which is also great.
Okay.
But the Vertigo stuff, he had just incredible artists like David Lloyd, Dave Gibbons. He had He did work with Chris Weston. The stuff that he did was just incredible. And if you are a fan of reading fiction or nonfiction around that era, his stuff is a must, I think. But he also has kind of translated that into some newer stuff, which is the book that I picked out that we'll get to later. I won't say what it is yet and spoil it. So obviously I like Garth Ennis, but what else do I like? I'm a big fan of Ed Brubaker.
Mm-hmm.
Ed Brubaker he's never written anything that hasn't let me down. I just read for the first time one of his first crime books that he put out, which was Scene of the Crime. Have you read that
with,
one?
Michael Lark.
Yeah.
I haven't read it yet, but
okay.
Yeah, I plan on reading it pretty soon.
I'll loan you my copy.
Cool.
It's great, and we could maybe save that for another time, but I wonder if Ed Brubaker has seen, I'm sure he has, but season 2 of True Detective on HBO seems like they lifted half of that from Scene of the Crime.
Really?
Yeah, okay. Ed Brubaker's he's just a hell of a writer. I've always loved everything he's put out. And I keep up with my DC, not as much as I probably should. I definitely tend to gravitate more towards your independent titles, though. Yeah, I've become more of a reader that follows certain writers and follows certain... I can't even say that I necessarily follow artists anymore, but I'll follow anything that Brubaker does, anything that Ennis does, and more concepts than anything else. I don't really follow characters. I used to buy everything that had the Punisher in it. And it kind of gets to the point where you have to pick and choose, and once I really love, not to beat a dead horse, but Garth Ennis' run on Punisher Max was my favorite run of the series. Yeah. So I just follow writers that I like, and those writers tend to usually be guys that are writing independent books or image titles, Dark Horse, things like that. Brian Wood, Briggsland. Okay. Fan of that. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. And this is a bit of a tangent, but...
that's what podcasts are all about, so I don't mind.
You mentioned that you read more independent stuff. I feel like there's kind of a migration of people reading, big 2 books over to, like, sometimes even exclusively independent stuff. Like, my dad started with comics back in the 90s, Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee and stuff, but now I don't think he reads one superhero book. Do you see that in subscription lists at your store?
I sort of do, but one thing that I would, I think everybody's interests are going to be fueled by a couple of things, but nostalgia still plays a big part into the books that we end up going back to. And I don't read a lot of superhero stuff anymore, but if you were to ask me if you said name your 10 favorite comic stories, almost all of them are going to be superhero stories. I'm going to say Kingdom Come. I'm going to say Jeff Johns' run on JSA, Kurt Busiek and Fabian Nicieza's run on Thunderbolts. Books that I would be hesitant to pick up and read now. Honestly, if somebody said, Thunderbolts, it's a great book, you should pick it up. It's about villains that try to turn into heroes, jump on in issue 43. Well, I read Thunderbolts from the first issue, and back in the 90s, before, you had your Usenet groups, but you didn't have the internet spoiling everything months before it comes out. So the Thunderbolts reveal was a shock at the time. It was a big surprise, and that was the hook that when I read that issue in the comic shop, that got me to buy the book and then follow it. And then it was the great character development that came after that kept me reading it.
Okay. Was that the first Thunderbolt series then?
It was. Okay. It was. And that was the one that Kurt Busiek and Mark Bagley did. But again, if somebody said you should jump in on this title now, I would be apprehensive. And I think that does a disservice to me, because I wonder how many really great stories are out there right now that I'm not jumping into because of that predilection now. Yeah. And that I guess almost expectation that you've sort of matured and you're going to be reading. Now I just read this, and I don't read Marvel, or I don't read DC. I don't read a lot of Marvel. I still do read DC, but I don't read a lot of Marvel. I guess my point is, I just wonder if that mentality that you brought up is holding people back from reading really, really great stories that maybe 10 years from now they look back at and say that's in my top 10, but it's superheroes. So, and that's without even going into anything that Alan Moore did, with a superhero.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Well, you want to get into the book then?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. All right, let's get into the book. Today we're going to be talking about Unknown Soldier, written by Garth Ennis and art by Killian Plunkett. It also has colors by James Sinclair and letterings done by Ellie DeVille. It's a DC Comics Vertigo 4-issue series from, I think, 97 to 98 is when it ran.
Sounds right.
Yeah, and just so you know, we will be going really in-depth into the book, so there definitely will be spoilers. That's not just a spoiler warning, it's a spoiler guarantee.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So I picked this book because we're trying to pick stuff that, A, I knew you hadn't read this, and B, it was something that isn't really tied to continuity. It's sort of it's a book that can be completely read in a vacuum, having no knowledge of the Silver Age character who known as the Unknown Soldier.
Yeah.
Although this kind of does reference some of that stuff in kind of a roundabout way.
Definitely.
It sort of makes that. I guess if you read this and then you go back and you reread some of the old Bob Kanigher Unknown Soldier, that it might put a new twist on it, which I think is always a cool thing. But to go into the creators a little bit before we start talking about the book, obviously Garth Ennis, I think I've said enough about.
Yeah, I think so.
Now, Killian Plunkett is an interesting guy. Are you familiar with him at all?
I had not heard of him before reading this.
Okay. What did you think of his art?
I liked it. It was good.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, I don't know why I haven't seen his stuff elsewhere, but what else has he done?
Well, not a whole hell of a lot.
Right.
He did. Now, I think he did some fill-in work on Mark Millar's Superman Red Sun.
Really?
He did. I know that at the very least he did a little bit of work on it. But the big thing that he did that I'm just as big a fan of is one of the 4. I suppose I should have mentioned this earlier, that one of the other franchises that I like to follow is the Aliens franchise, going back to the early Dark Horse stuff before Alien 3 came out.
Yeah.
I've always loved that stuff. Predator as well, although those stories haven't been quite as good. But Killian Plunkett did a 4-issue series called Aliens Labyrinth that is one of the top 2 or 3 non-movie Aliens stories. And he did the art for that, just phenomenally detailed.
Cool.
I think that the guy, he has a very, very, I don't know, you're more the creative type. How would you describe his art style?
I mean, there's lots of shadows that are used. I'd probably call it like a noir looking. I mean, it definitely works with that type of genre.
So you could see him doing something with Brubaker or Rucka or one of those guys?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I definitely can see him working with Garth Ennis. I mean, not just after reading this, but it just kind of seems like something you'd see.
But anyway, so Killian Plunkett, he's a guy who hasn't done a lot of stuff. But the story is something that when people tell me that they like espionage or they like a lot, I've recommended this book to a lot of people that like Greg Rucka, Queen and Country, things like that.
I can definitely see that.
It's a spy book.
Yeah,
the main character works for he's a CIA agent. And they start off with him sort of telling off his superiors in Washington for not killing. he's kind of recapping a mission in the beginning.
Yeah.
And they tell him off for not killing some kids that were supposed to be part of the mission because he
I think there were witnesses to it or something like
yeah,
that.
exactly. But he ended up, he says, he tells them off for about 3 panels and kind of explains it. But he's a very, very professional guy. He's a very professional character. But I do like how this is the quote that starts it off, where one of these very X-Files-esque smoking men sitting in the dark room questioning him, looking at slides of all the dead bodies, says, there's one question still troubling us. Sergeant Morris's report mentioned 2 witnesses to the shooting who you, in fact, allowed safe passage from the area. Any explanation for that, Agent Clyde? And he goes on and on for like a whole page, and then the part that really matters is he says, so might I respectfully submit that in the future, if I'm to be required to murder children, such instructions should be specifically stated within each mission's parameters. And then it's kind of, it pans to the guys that are the smoking men behind the scenes, and one of them's kind of pinching his brow. And
just a perfect silent panel there.
Exactly. And then Clyde, they say, thank you, Agent Clyde, that will be all, and he walks out, and one of them says, fucking Boy Scout. And he says, what the hell are we doing with someone like him in the field? So right away, they sort of paint a picture of what he's about. He's a guy who's not afraid to do wet work. You know, he's somebody that'll go out and he'll lead a mission and kill. He's not afraid to kill, and he's not afraid to get blood on his hands.
Yeah.
But he's also not a sadist, and he's not a sociopath, and he's not going to just go out and murder a bunch of children because they saw him do this. You know, he's a guy that has morals and he has boundaries. So right off the bat, within 2 pages, 3 pages, they do a great job establishing who this main character is.
And I think that's a perfect way of starting the story because, I mean, because of his ideals and, you know, wanting to be better than other people, he really sticks out like a sore thumb.
But it's not wanting to be better than other people. It's as much as it is.
That's a bad way of putting it.
he has. But you also put it correctly that he's a man of high ideals, and he believes in America. He believes in and I guess to preface this, it's going to be hard. This story and kind of dissecting the story is going to be really easy to get into politics. You think so?
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, because the whole point of it's sort of vague, but he believes in America, and he believes in what America represents. And that becomes a big part later in the book, and kind of, I guess, the biggest theme in the book.
Definitely, yeah.
So these guys tell him to go do something for his country. He does it, but he's not going to cross the line. You know, he's not going to cross the line and kill kids, because that's not what America's about, and that's not what he's about as a representative of someone who believes in his country.
It sounds like he would do it if he was ordered to, but he's just he's doing whatever he can to
correct
to live in the world that he prefer to live in.
So after that, it shows him back at his desk and in his CIA offices, and right off the bat, a couple of his coworkers are kind of giving him grief for, like they say, coming to the party tonight, Clyde, and he says, I wasn't planning on it. And they give him grief because obviously he's a guy who never goes to parties, and they make fun of him that he must be standing up for the national anthem and saluting the flag, occasionally saying hell, but never fuck, and worshiping his mom's apple pie. And he kind of, responds to them with a witty remark, but you can tell it's kind of true in a way. And again, they're really doing a good job fleshing out the character, showing his relationship with his superiors, with his coworkers, how they view him. But that's where the interesting stuff starts, where he gets back to his desk and there's a list of names on his computer. And this is really what starts the story. And do you have any thoughts so far? Characterization, anything?
I think I'm good at the moment.
Okay.
I'm definitely going to add a little bit in later. Actually, I think Clyde. Is that his first name or his last name? I forgot. I think it says on his desk there.
It's William Clyde.
William Clyde, yeah. He has very, like, Captain America-like ideals in this very realistic world, which I think really fits in with a lot of the themes of the story, which we'll touch on later.
No, that's a good way to put it. He's more of a realist Captain America without the super soldier serum, but willing to go shoot people in the head.
Yeah.
During some wet works or something.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so he gets this list of names on his computer, and he goes to start investigating them because he just assumes that they were put on his computer to follow up on as part of his job. And the first name is Joshua Markowitz, and he goes and he visits this guy he does a little research and finds out where he lives, and he is in a retirement home. So he goes and he visits him. While he's there, they tell him that he suffers from Alzheimer's, but they show in the panel where he's walking down to his room, there's a woman calling someone. We don't know who the shadowy person is, but she calls and says, yeah, again, no doubt at all. So you know that that's something that's going to come back into it later on. Mm-hmm. So he goes and visits this guy, Joshua Markowitz, and he thinks, at this point, Clyde thinks that this is tied into a different investigation. He doesn't know anything about the unknown soldier yet or anything like that. He thinks it's tied to some investigation about an organization called California First. And he starts talking to him, and he finds out that somebody else was there recently, also from the CIA, talking to him. And he's a little quizzical about that. And he says, what were you talking about? And this old man in his 80s in the retirement home tells him, we talked about the soldier. Of course, we know who the soldier is, but to Agent Clyde here, he has no idea. Mm. And it turns out, in talking to Markowitz for a while, he tells him about his run-in with this character named the Soldier, and how he was 18 years old when he was in the European theater and he went to Dachau, obviously one of the concentration camps. Something you'd never forget, no matter what. And it's certainly the unknown soldier's going to add to that. So he talks about them going into Dachau and seeing the unknown soldiers showing up in like a command jeep, and right after they liberated it. And he's this big, hulking, intimidating figure with your classic unknown soldier face wrap.
Yeah.
And you can just tell that this guy is in charge right away. He's got command about him. And he walks in, and there's this big splash page where the soldier he's unbelievably pissed off, and the splash page is him standing amongst a whole bunch of emaciated concentration camp bodies at Dachau. And the gist of the story is that the unknown soldier is so pissed off about this that he runs and he grabs a Thompson from some guy and mows down all of the German soldiers. And he says, first off, one of the officers that he's with starts saying that codename Unknown Soldier has totally fucking lost it. And the whole time the Unknown Soldier is mowing down these German officers that are trying to run away. And he said, that the officer says, for Christ's sake, if word gets out about this, and he says, the world should know, if this is what our enemies do, if this is what America must fight, then we are always right. And anything we do is right. And so you kind of see right off the bat that the Unknown Soldier has a parallel to William Clyde, in a way, where he's saying he believes in his country, but unlike William Clyde, who's been brought up to believe in his country, the Unknown Soldier has been tested through wars and conflicts, and going in and seeing something like Dachau. Obviously, you're going to be as somebody who's actually own a book in there that was written by one of the liberators of Dachau, and it's really, really interesting. In fact, I'll show it to you after we're done recording.
Sounds good.
But I mean, the shit that those guys walked into. My grandpa was in the Pacific, and he was one of the liberators of Santo Tomas.
Yeah.
Which is equally bad, but equally as bad an experience, I would assume. But the stuff that they saw in Dachau and Auschwitz and Sobibor, you can imagine how that would shape. Using that as a story element there are a few more powerful things than that to shape someone's worldview and outlook.
Absolutely.
And just like Nazis being like the greatest villains of all time, right? Using an experience like that, I think, is going to just shape a character better than most other things could.
Absolutely. And like it's great that they started with World War II here, because I think Axel Alonso did a foreword in my paper book here, and I think it was Axel Alonso. I think he edited this. And he was talking about how back in World War II, it was pretty clear who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. Mm-hmm. And in the current world, which is the late 90s at this point, that line is kind of less clear. The things that the army are doing might be a little questionable.
Well,
where, back in World War II,
and the story, as we'll get to, gets progressively more stuck in the muck.
Definitely.
About who's good and who's bad and who's directing things. But more than anything, I think you have to start at World War II, because the Unknown Soldier, in the original stories, when he came out in Our Army at War, was a World War II character that was very much like this, although certainly a lot tamer according to the standards of what DC was putting out in the 60s and 70s. But compared to some of the stuff that DC was putting out in their war books then, you had a lot of stuff that was very, very earnest. The stories were very well told. But then you also had kind of maybe goofier, sillier stories, like the War the Time Forgot stuff, and I think it was Star Spangled War stories, where they would have the dinosaurs and things like that. You'd have a dogfight between like a P-51 and a pterodactyl. Unknown Soldier tended to be more serious, more kind of ground level. Yeah. They would have stories with consequences. Minor and some of these were 16, 22-page stories, but you get to know some character, and then that character doesn't make it out of the story. They were really, really great about creating these real quick, small, done-in-one stories that wrapped up. It had a beginning, it had a middle, and an end, but it was all in World War II. The Unknown Soldier. There were later, besides Ennis's, there were some later Unknown Soldier stories where they transported him to different conflicts. I think
New 52 tried to put him in the Suicide Squad for a little bit.
Well, yeah. And then there was another Vertigo one, and I never read it, but I think it was like a character named Unknown Soldier in South Africa or something.
Okay.
If I'm wrong, forgive me, because I haven't read that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, to your point, I think they, starting in World War II, is linking it to its roots, and also linking it to the greatest conflict that the world has ever seen, and the most black and white conflict that the world has ever seen, and a conflict like that could shape this character's moral worldview for the rest of the book and the rest of his life.
Yeah, and like a huge theme of the book is talking about kind of the deterioration of morality with war and just America in general, and it kind of, as we'll see, it kind of gradually goes bad. I just want to talk about this scene that we were talking about for a little bit. Just when they're at the concentration camp, it shows Markowitz as a soldier, and they go like a whole 2 pages without actually showing the bodies. It starts off with like just like a view of him and other soldiers just looking out and just look completely traumatized. And I just think it's great how I don't want to say the word, they kind of tease it, but they're building up to it, and when they get to that splash page with all the bodies there, it's just it's really effective, even though you know what you're going to see.
Yeah, you know how bad it's going to be when the transition panel from when he's talking to the 80-year-old guy in the retirement home, and then the next panel right next to that is him as an 18-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
You just see going from one where it's bright kind of normal comic coloring to the whole flashback scene has this kind of dark red tinged coloring style to it, and you just know that it's anyone who starts off a story with "I was 18 when I went into DACA," there's nothing good that can come out of that.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. All right.
So
we're ready to keep going.
Yeah, jumping past that, he investigates this a little bit, goes back to his to this CIA headquarters, and talks to and this is one of the things that I always thought was kind of interesting, and we'll touch on it a little bit more. But his coworker Wallace, who's a woman,
yes,
and she's one of the people earlier on kind of giving him grief about not going to the party and saluting the flag and eating apple pie. But she's there when he gets back to the office, and he's doing a search for the unknown soldier, and nothing comes up. But she asked him if he would want to go to this party with her. And he said yes. And she shows up at... Well, actually, no. Sorry, I was wrong. Later on, she shows up at his apartment to ask him if he wants to go to the party with her. And earlier on in the book, they had shown this female agent, some sort of operative or assassin who gets called after he goes to visit the old guy in the retirement home. And later on, when he's back in his apartment and this coworker of his shows up, it has this panel where she is set up on the rooftop next to his apartment building, mm-hmm. and she's watching him with some sort of sniper rifle and ends up shooting him. Well, she says she was told to give him The Frighteners, which would
Peter Jackson movie, right?
Yeah, give him a Peter Jackson DVD. I love that movie. It's a great movie.
It's a good one, yeah.
But she's told to give him just The Frighteners, which means fire a bullet through his window and blow something up to intimidate him to mm-hmm. move away from investigating the unknown soldier. And what she doesn't know is that his coworker showed up. So she ends up shooting this mug that he's holding to try to send this message, the Frighteners, whatever you call it.
Yeah.
But ends up, right when she shoots the mug, Wallace opens the door and she gets shot and killed in his apartment building. I thought it was because it was sort of like I said, this book has a lot of stuff that you can kind of dredge into real life analogs, and to me that scene was sort of I don't know, it brought to mind something like Ruby Ridge, where and when Vicky Weaver got shot by the FBI agents who were shooting through the door to try to hit Randy Weaver, but they shoot her instead. It was that sort of thing, and I wondered because this came out 20 years ago now, and that came out after things like Ruby Ridge and Waco and a lot of these things where people's mistrust, and even X-Files, which had, I think, played off of a lot of the people's distrust of government, and this is without really getting into either political party, sprung out of, you look at like Watergate coming out of the 70s, and that sort of started this distrust. Not that it wasn't, a lot of distrust wasn't there, but kind of the general public's distrust of things. Movies like All the President's Men. And Watergate sort of set the tone, but then you started having things like Ruby Ridge and Waco, and then you had Oklahoma City, and a lot of stuff where it was just, I guess, people didn't trust their government, and they didn't trust the people that were supposed to be the authorities over them. And I think that transcends both. It transcends political parties in a way, and that's what that reminded me of was Ruby Ridge. And I always wondered if Ennis intended for that to be the case or not, to bring up some kind of, government cock-up like that. I'm not a survivalist by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying that's what it reminded me of.
Okay.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask him if I ever met him.
Something I want to bring up here. I mean, it definitely shows multiple times during the series. As people who read comics quite a bit, I'm sure that we kind of overlook sound effects that are put into there. Like a lot of times I read a book and don't even realize that there are sound effects. In this book, there are none whatsoever. The gun is shot here, and the art kind of speaks for the sound itself.
Yeah, it's a great panel.
Is that something that's in a lot of Garth Ennis work? Do you think that was a choice that he made?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Okay. Because like something What are your opinions on sound effects?
I guess if it fits the story, I have no problem with it. I think that a good sound effect could be, for instance, if it was a war, let's say it's a World War II book, and you're supposed to hear, maybe there's a panel where some characters are out in the open and they hear, I don't know, some bombers approaching or something.
Yeah.
Would it make sense to have a following panel where it shows the planes creeping up on them, or would it be better to just have one of the characters maybe look up and you hear like a whir in the background or something? Maybe the top of the panel is like whir, and all of a sudden you're hearing propellers, and that's what is. I think a sound effect like that is going to be one thing. I think that
definitely, and that's necessary to show what's happening,
right? But people's go-to, I think, sound effects, and I would say to most comics' detriment, are the old Adam West, rest in peace, this week, but the old Batman 66 bow, pop, zam type of thing where every time you hit somebody. I don't think there's a place for those sound effects anymore. But I think sound effects in comics, like I described, if it's something that's necessary for the plot, is totally useful. But do I think that this panel in Unknown Soldier needed any sound effects? No, because the art is going to convey what happened better than any sound effect you could slam over the panel.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Sometimes, I mean, it really depends on the art itself, because art, I mean, it isn't really a science or anything. I mean, some things tonally might work with sound effects, but I think a lot of, probably especially mainstream books, kind of just use them because it's part of comics, and they kind of think of it as something that they should use. I mean, a script I wrote recently, I kind of just felt like I had to put them in there, and then I went back later and I thought, like, I'm pretty sure this will be a lot more effective if I just don't have it in there.
Do you think it's something where you might have it in your script to do, you give it to the artist, you get it back, and it's so good that, like, conditionally, you might say, there might be a sound effect, do your best, or it'll be a sound effect depending on how you draw the panel or something like that. Like,
yeah.
I think that maybe that's an area where you want to trust your artist.
Definitely. I think a lot of times that sound effects are used, it's kind of undermining the artist's ability to show what's going on. I mean, it's probably not what they mean to do, but I think it kind of distracts from the art and everything that can do. But I mean, have you read Scott Cloud's Understanding Comics?
Yeah, but it was like
okay.
It was like 15, 20 years ago.
I mean, you'll understand what I'm saying anyway. I mean, comics is all about filling in the blank with your imagination. And, I mean, usually that's in between panels, just imagining movement and everything. But, I mean, in this, I think silent gunshot panels like this, for example, they're really useful because your brain is coming up with a sound effect for that gunshot that's going to be a lot more effective than some blam or boom or something like that.
Yeah,
I mean,
and there's even little detail, like the gun that she's using in the previous page even though it's not something that's emphasized at all, it's suppressed. You can see it has a suppressor on it, so it's probably going to make that
but
that typical. You would, in your mind, you're going to hear that typical movie silencer sound when it gets shot. You're not going to hear a gunshot. So that's something that's even going to be harder to convey with a sound effect. If you put a pow or something in there, it's not what's meant to be. It's not the sound that's meant to be heard out of that gun.
Yeah.
So that's just, I guess that's a little thing too that helps, going from having that to the silent panel where the mug that he's holding explodes, and then you see blood coming where Wallace gets hit. There probably wouldn't be sound other than the glass breaking, and that is conveyed by the glass blowing apart in his hand.
Yeah.
No, it's a cool observation though.
Yeah, thanks.
That leads to the kind of a weird thing later on. We can just jump ahead to that, where it creates this kind of weird thing where this woman that he was in the office with, Wallace, all of a sudden people think that they were an item, and I think one of the coworkers later on says something like, "So you two were fucking or something?" And do you remember that?
He's like, "Actually, we weren't."
Yeah, we weren't. She was nice to me and came to my apartment once.
But that left an impression.
Yeah, it did. Later. But what ends up happening later on is, whether it is a figment of his imagination or it's actually some kind of ghost, it's most likely a figment of his imagination. Wallace keeps showing up at strange times, and he'll have conversations with her in a car, in a building, wherever. So obviously her getting shot was something that had a very big effect on him. It was somebody who showed him a little bit of kindness. And he's a guy who probably was very uptight and didn't have a lot of friends, and certainly probably didn't have a lot of girlfriends. And all of a sudden a pretty woman shows up and asks him to go to a party, and then she gets killed for just being in his house. Yeah. And that's something that's going to stay with you, I think. So that it's not just kind of a one-off event. It definitely has
It speaks a lot about the character, just because, as someone who's experienced a little bit of loneliness and isolation, it says a lot that like probably like 3-minute interaction, just someone giving him the time of day, to invite him to a party, and
taking the time to show up at his house.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they don't even blatantly say it at first, but it just talks a lot about just this guy's place in the world, and how not only his ideals, but just his personality just doesn't really fit in the world that he's in right now.
Right. He's kind of almost too good for them.
Mm-hmm.
But not that he would think that. So he goes back to the office and he keeps investigating the names on this list, and he goes to visit this other guy who, every time he goes to visit one of these people, he gets another piece or two of information, and he still has no idea who put this list of names on his computer, but he's just investigating them. And he goes to this other guy named Martin Fuchs, who asks him if he's from Colonel Booth's department, and he just kind of plays along. He says, "Correct. Colonel Booth sent you to see me." Now he goes to see him, and of course, just like with the older guy, he ends up telling him about his experience with the unknown soldier, which was in Iran in '53, and the soldier has this guy take him to see the Shah, and he says, let's see here. He goes up to him and he says, let's see here. The Shah says, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm an American who wants to know why you insult his country." And he says, "What?" He says, "By what right do you refuse us? By what prerogative do you reject our aid? You will order Mohammed Mossadegh to step down. You will rule your country directly and absolutely. You will follow the edicts of the United States government 100%, or we will bomb Iran back into the desert, and I will come for you." And then this guy that he's talking to, who's explaining this flashback, says, that was that. One look into those eyes, and there's no question the Shah would do anything but get rid of Mossadegh. And when he was leaving, he said something about what right did Americans have to give him orders in his own country, to which the unknown soldier says, the moral right. And that's the end of that flashback. It was a very quick one. But after he leaves, this same assassin shows up that took the pot shot at him and ended up hitting Wallace and kills that old guy.
Screwball is her name, I think?
Screwball, yeah. And she ends up, and then you find out also that she killed the old guy in the retirement home too.
Mm-hmm.
But as he's driving to the next name on the list that he had, he starts having an interaction with Wallace.
Yeah.
And it's one of those times where she's telling him he's crazy, and he's not really. He's just kind of playing along and talking to her. Mm-hmm. But he gets to the next place, and the guy there's a bunch of corpses there already. So somebody has already beaten him to the punch on this one. Then he ends up going to the next name on the list. So somebody beat him to the punch on one. He ends up going to another one. And I think, before we get to that, we'll jump up and get another beer.
Yes, we will. I think we're good.
Hey, okay. After we've gotten proper libations again, we left off where he'd gotten beat to the punch at one of the names on his list and found a bunch of corpses there. So he ends up going to this house in Alaska, and it's a guy wearing flannel with a big beard.
Yep.
And he talks about it, and you can kind of see what's going on here. This guy is talking about running into. I guess he's going to say it better than I can. So he says, Clyde says, I don't think this is exactly about you. And the guy says, you're goddamn right it's not. It's about Codename Unknown Soldier, Vietnam, 1970, and a little piece of fucking genocide just over the Cambodian border. So you know that's not going to be great. But long story short, and we can talk a little bit about some of the history of the Unknown Soldier. One of the bits of the Unknown Soldier was that he was a guy who was he would always have the bandages on. You never knew who he was, but he would often show up undercover, almost like a Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible. He'd be wearing masks over his face to look like somebody different, and he would. It didn't matter. He could look like an officer. He could look like a French partisan. But whatever served the story, he was undercover. He was the Unknown Soldier.
I mean, he's, for those who have seen Sam Raimi's film Darkman, he is
Darkman.
He is the exact same character, except, he came first.
Yeah, very, very first. But this guy's story is that basically these guys in Vietnam were ordered to burn up clear out a couple of villages and basically torch everybody in the villages. And these guys wouldn't do it. They were gonna not follow through at their order. And all of a sudden somebody shows up, and it is General Westmoreland, who was the commanding officer, the guy in charge of Vietnam at that time.
Okay.
Walks into his building and starts chewing him out and telling him that he is to kill that he used to pass along the orders to the guys in the field to kill all of these prisoners and then withdraw. And he says, how could he say no to? He's not going to say no to Westmoreland. It'd be like saying no to Eisenhower in World War II. Mm-hmm. And this guy that he's talking to, that Clyde is talking to, who's telling the flashback, says that he told me later it took 2 hours. He's talking about one of his friends who was actually killing everybody on the other side. And he says, John lost 4 of his people. You know where he is now? Chained up in a mental institution because he's been trying to chew his wrists open for 70 years. So, again, we go from, Yeah, go ahead. We go from kind of an escalating. We start with World War II, where we were, and there's always people with revisionist history, but we were clearly on the right side, you know.
Yeah.
Now, the interference in Iran, that's something where it starts getting into a real gray area, and certainly Vietnam was not known for being a clear-cut good guy, bad guy conflict by any stretch of the imagination. And that's one of the reasons that I always thought that anytime they tried to take the Punisher out of Vietnam, that it was such a big mistake. You had so many things that happened on both sides in Vietnam, and you got to remember that most of the guys that were there because of the draft. These weren't people that wanted to be there, you know, and they didn't want to be in Vietnam. But these soldiers were drafted, and so you had, for every horrible thing that you hear about Vietnam, you hear about the Hanoi Hilton, you hear about the treatment that POWs got, driving bamboo under their fingernails, and all the different terrible ways that that they were killed in captivity. You also had things like what happened with William Calley when they slaughtered that village. They killed all the men, women, and children. But even in that, you had those guys that went nuts. But you also had that was the My Lai massacre. But you also had guys that I believe got the Medal of Honor for trying to stop that conflict. You had like a helicopter pilot who set his helicopter down in between the troops that were firing some of the villagers. So it's just something where you had heroes on both sides, and you had people that just were not. The situation that they were put in was completely nuts. It was madness for them. And how do you deal with something like that? How do you deal with you don't know if the old lady that's coming up to you out of a rice paddy is just coming up to say thank you, or if she's got a bomb strapped to her, you know, and she's going to blow up you and your buddies. And you don't know if that 6-year-old boy walking up to you, if he's got a bomb in his basket, or if it's loaded with rice. You have no idea. And so those guys, the stuff that they had to do, it was not, and that's happened in war since war began, but it certainly was not a clear-cut thing. And I think that's sort of the theme of The Unknown Soldier, and the theme of this book is that people do horrible shit, and sometimes you don't even know the reason for doing it, you know, or you do it for the wrong reason. And I think that it's certainly reflected well in here, where the Unknown Soldier is a guy, if you were influenced by the stuff that he had seen in World War II, then you're going to have a different approach, and you think that your country is always right. And even when they're maybe necessarily not. Now, this fictional Cambodian massacre that they talk about in the book, we know that's it's completely made up, but it's certainly something that fits. Mm-hmm. It fits the story well, and thematically, it's something that could have happened. But the most important part of this whole flashback is where this guy who's telling the flashback he got drunk and he was going to go in and tell off Westmoreland, but he walks into what's supposed to be Westmoreland's building, and it's the Unknown Soldier in there, kind of just in the shadows, standing in the shadows, and there's Westmoreland's face, much like Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible, laying off on the ground. And so that was this guy's run-in with the Unknown Soldier. But shortly after he tells Clyde this story, he gets shot in the head by this assassin who's followed him there named Screwball. And that leads to a gunfight between the two of them. And he ends up getting kind of the upper hand on her and holding her at gunpoint. And he ends up I think he kind of ties her up and starts questioning her. And she ends up sort of becoming an ally a little bit, because they send a kill team. Whoever's in charge of this whole shebang. Whoever was in charge of sending Screwball to kill him sends some special ops team to kill both of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so they end up sort of teaming up against them. And they take out this... Well, she does most of the work, but they end up taking out this team and deciding that even though she killed Wallace and she was there to kill him, that since they're both targets now, that I guess they'd be better off working together for to figure out what's going on. And so she starts giving him a little bit of information, and it's kind of funny because it shows her in the back seat when he's talking to this figment of his imagination that is Wallace.
Yeah.
And obviously he looks a little bit nuts, but Screwball is a little bit nuts too, so
definitely.
It doesn't really matter. What are your thoughts on Screwball so far?
Definitely an interesting character. I mean, at this point in the story, you don't really go much into her background or anything, but I guess I'll just say it right away since we'll go to it later. I think they mentioned that she was taken from like a mental institute or something like that, and
when she was a kid, right?
Yeah, something like that. But I found that very, very interesting because, I mean, this story is taking place in this corrupted world where you have to make these, terrible decisions sometimes. And, I mean, they had someone who's literally messed up in the head carrying out some of these things.
Sure.
And I just found that really, really interesting how they...
Well, if you're gonna have professional killers, you don't want a normal person doing it. You don't want someone who's got a normal idea of morality going out to just kill whatever list of people you give them. You have to have screwed up people. You have to have sociopaths, people that have no emotion at all.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you're right. It's a neat aspect of the character.
And I find this is a pretty cool part of the story because it kind of makes you just Clyde working with Screwball at this point after she had killed, a bunch of, old guys from the war and killed Wallace and everything. Just kind of gives you the sense of, that Clyde is kind of becoming a little more corrupt.
He's venturing into the gray area.
Yeah.
Even though it's presented as being purely pragmatic, that it's going to be better for him to team up with her because it's going to help him achieve his end and help keep him alive a little bit more, to have a trained killer on, working with him. They're kind of working to the same end, but you certainly get the feeling that it's a temporary alliance.
Mm-hmm. You have the flashbacks that are kind of showing the decline and morality of the unknown soldier.
Right.
And at the same time, you're not really seeing a decline in morality with Clyde, but he's kind of he's falling down into some sort of spiral. So it's kind of cool seeing the story progress down for both of them. Well,
and something to take away from the people on the list is that these people are put on this list chronologically. The first name on the list was from World War II. The second name on the list was somebody who had information about the soldier in Iran. The third name on the list, that person got killed. We don't know. What did they have? They have something to do with, running into the soldier in Korea? Who knows? The fourth name on the list had a run-in in Vietnam. So it's chronological, and we're creeping closer to modern day, but every story that's told veers a little bit more away from, that original, as we keep the horse that we keep beating, that World War II story in the concentration camp, where there's no question that we were, like, if you were in that concentration camp and you had a Thompson and all those SS officers were right there, would you, you look around and you see I couldn't blame anyone for doing that.
Yeah, he's not supposed to be doing it, but
no,
it's still it makes sense because these are
it's like the most horrific shit that's ever happened in the entire world.
And I know there were some quote unquote Nazis who were kind of like forced into it, but they still did terrible
well,
shit.
your German, so your average German soldier was, man, I don't know how deep we want to get into this, but yeah, you had a lot of German soldiers and guys that were farmers, and they didn't care about the ideological associations of the National Socialist Party. So yeah, those guys weren't. But on the other hand, a lot of those German soldiers were tough because those guys had been. You had a lot of them, especially if they were officers or older guys. They'd been, soldiers in World War I. They had been in the Spanish Civil War. These are guys that were no strangers to combat. But again, you're correct that a lot of them were not fighting for the ideology of the Nazis.
I mean,
there's a clear line.
I'm not saying that's an excuse at all. But,
right. But remember, there's a big difference between your average German soldier who's in the, fighting on the Eastern Front or freezing to death in Stalingrad, and your SS officer who worked at a concentration camp. Yeah,
and I think that first flashback, one of the guys says we just guard.
Right.
And
that's something that's really, it's interesting because it's still going on. They're still they're identifying guys that are from that were camp guards or
back when I was in school, we were kind of following this case.
Really?
With someone who was
it the Djurdjevic guy?
Oh,
the guy who,
okay. It was my freshman year, so it was like
the guy who got sent back
ago.
He got sent to Germany to be put on trial, and I think he died.
Maybe.
I think he died while he was on trial.
Yeah, but we were like trying to figure out. It was so long ago. Like, should we forgive this or not? But,
it's such.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so, and I think that's why I've seen some great movies where, and this is stuff with, I think it was one I saw recently with Martin Landau. I can't remember the name, but it had Martin Landau and it had Christopher Plummer, where Christopher Plummer starts off the movie as someone who thought he was someone who had been in a concentration camp, and he's hunting down this officer who was the head of this camp, and I don't want to give away the ending because it's actually a really, really good movie.
Okay.
But it was, to me, it was more fascinating to watch a bunch of guys in their mid to late 80s operate sort of a geriatric spy movie than anything else, just because of the subject matter at hand. And you got to think 10 years from now, we're not going to have any of these guys left.
Mm-hmm.
And this type of thing, that's why this, again, the Nazis and what went on in World War II in Europe it lends itself, they are the best villains. They are. I mean, you look at the eugenics programs that they had, and you look at the Final Solution, and everything from liquidating Polish ghettos to Mengele's experiments in Auschwitz. There was so much sadistic, evil stuff that was done in the name of progress. And when that goes, I think we like to think that we have evolved as a society, as a world. But that's why those movies where there's some 92-year-old Nazi officer who got away, I think it's such a captivating and fascinating thing, because we know that in a few years they're all going to be gone. But you still have, I think most people still have that, you want justice, and you want to catch these sons of bitches before they die and they're taken by old age. Catch the guys. And it leads to such good story material that I think that in a couple of years, when all those guys are gone, that it's going to be a shame to have lost all the great veterans that we have. But story-wise, there's also going to be, I guess, kind of a dearth of possible topics like that. But there's a tangent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And I was just saying that whole thing about, Nazi soldiers who I was just saying that as a devil's advocate thing, but we went into there. But yeah, like that first flashback is really, it almost gives you a sense of satisfaction.
Hell yeah, it does. Right.
Seeing him just shoot down a bunch of Nazis because, I mean, whether they were forced into it or not, like they were doing terrible things. And then just over time, well, you have him intimidating that I forgot what it was called. Was he like a religious leader or something?
The Shah?
The Shah,
of Iran?
Yeah.
He was the leader of the country.
I don't know. I don't know much about.
Well, and this is the cool thing with this now, and I was going to save this topic for the end, but we've said that Clyde works for the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the CIA and all this stuff where things kind of start going wrong in the book, these sort of gray area operations that the soldiers are part of. There's a lot of stuff where I think the big theme of the book is America and the ideology and what America stands for is as great as it has ever been. But it can easily be co-opted. It can very easily be co-opted. And my takeaway was that we're not fighting a war against evil in this book. What we're doing is we're fighting a war for the CIA's best interest. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's why I said that it's going to be so hard not to jump into politics, but I kind of want to keep it more vague than anything else. I just think that it is it's something where the further you get away from World War II in this book, the more shady shit there is.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think that the end of the book does a really great job of showing that your ideologist or your ideologue, I should say, ideologist. I don't think that's a word.
Just
you put enough beers in us, and we'll just make up whatever word we want.
Yeah.
But your ideologue can still believe and make the right decision because of how much they believe in America and they believe in what it stands for, going up against somebody who's taken that exact same route and gone the opposite way and become a cynic and become someone who has been co-opted just like the country has been. Does it make sense?
Yeah. Okay. You're making sense.
Okay, good.
I just want to talk about this one moment right
here.
Yeah,
please do.
When he's talking to not Wallace, while Screwball's in the back. It's kind of interesting because I imagine her as a figment of his imagination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too.
Like most of the time, she's always calling him crazy, and there are these two panels that I just found really, really effective. And she says, "You are a hopelessly incurable, a delusional romantic. I asked you to come to a party, Clyde. I smiled at you. How out of that do you manage to turn me into your ideal woman? How could you think you would know me so well?" And there's just a panel of him. He looks kind of mentally troubled. He's just looking straight ahead at the road, and it just has 3 dots, and he said it was a nice smile. And just back on what I said before, just like his sense of isolation and stuff.
Oh, sure.
That was just a perfect depiction of it, and then there's just this page-wide thin panel of them driving, and I think Wallace just says, "I give up," which, it's just great.
No,
I found
that
agree. Very effective. There's just this whole book makes a very good use of, and not only just silent panels, but panels that have less dialogue.
No, I agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and
we'll see more of that.
To jump into the next thing now, Screwball, obviously, that now that they've teamed up, she's somebody who's plugged directly into what's going on, so she's able to give him some information, and they show up at the guy who's been pulling all the strings, who's been sending Screwball to kill these people and to kill Clyde.
Some of the strings.
Some of the strings. But they show up at his house, wherever it is, and we have another one of those kind of soundless panels where, but this one, if you pay attention, where she shoots the butler right in the head when he opens the door. Screwball does, but her pistol's not silenced, so you can imagine a loud gunshot to this one if you so desire. Anyway, so this guy who's sort of he's a heavier set black guy, probably in his early 60s, comes out and he sees that it's Screwball and he's terrified, and he starts talking about, here's where he says she was recruited out of a lunatic asylum. But then Clyde says, but she's a Girl Scout next to the man you've been protecting, isn't she? And this is where the general says, comparing Screwball to the unknown soldier, you may as well say Jeffrey Dahmer looks good next to Genghis Khan. It's different levels, it's different worlds. I should know I'm the only man alive on this earth who's seen him go to war. Now you get your big flashback. And we jump forward again into Nicaragua. And he says, I had a pretty good Vietnam with Marine Recon, which, by the way, Frank Castle was Marine Recon. Mm-hmm. And by 84, I'd made Major, doing a lot of work for the company in Nicaragua. So he says, Washington wasn't impressed by our progress in disrupting the new government's reforms. They wanted results. They send, and this is another thing where I just noticed this as a big Garth Ennis fan, where they're kind of on a hill overlooking this Nicaraguan little village. And this guy says, they finished the hospital 10 days ago, Colonel. And this is it's some Delta Force team and the unknown soldier. And he says, good. And then he says, give me the 60. Well, if you've read Bourne, which is the 4-issue miniseries that Garth Ennis wrote, that's kind of the prequel to his Punisher Max run. Okay. The 3rd issue of Bourne it ends with this giant Viet Cong attack on the fire base that Frank Castle is at that point in command of. And the last panel of the book was Frank Castle kind of grimly looking on, and he says, give me the 60, which is what's going on right here. The M60. So anyways, he says the guy that's this general that's telling the flashback to Clyde and Screwball says that he went into the hospital with the M60 and didn't stop until he'd capped off 5 full belts. Then he had me march the Contras in. And now we know that this is a soldier with some kind of disguise on, but he says that you do that, whatever they build, whatever they give, however they try to worm their way into the nation's heart, this is what you do. You continue until the people understand the Sandinistas can give them nothing that the Contras cannot take away. And no governments can survive in Nicaragua without the backing of the United States. And then it pans to, I guess as well as you can do a pan in comic books. The next panel is, you know what? This is a great example because the top panel is the unknown soldier pointing directly at the reader, and then the bottom panel is the carnage left over from him using this 50 cal to blow to hell everybody else in there. And he says, is that a 30 cal? I don't know.
See, I wouldn't know.
Anyways, after that, hold on.
You're going to look it up?
I should know this.
Well, you look it up. I just want to comment on this flashback. And you said we know that this guy is the unknown soldier, even though, he has a face and everything. I just find it really interesting how Killian Plunkett is able to...
762, sorry.
Okay. It's okay.
I apologize.
It's okay. It's interesting how just placing that emphasis on this character in the panels at this point in the story just lets you know and insinuates that this is the unknown soldier as opposed to just this guy.
Well, he's kind of a hulking intimidating figure, and he has
definitely. I mean, he's like probably a foot taller than most people
for sure, and he's kind of got this intimidating jawline, and I think you're supposed to be able to tell that it's him for the reader.
Oh, absolutely. I just think it's interesting how naturally it comes to you.
Absolutely. So then the general's continuing telling his story, and he says, after that, they hunted us with everything they had. And they caught us about 5 clicks from our dust-off. And it shows them getting completely taken apart in this fight. And the guy, the younger version of the guy telling the story, gets shot. And then it shows the soldier who earlier on in this the previous page gets shot in the face. Well, this bullet tore off whatever mask he was wearing, and now it's and now it's the unknown soldier, and he is pissed off. And he's still got his gun, and he starts firing. And the guy says they came at us for 2 hours. They outnumbered us 50-1, and he killed them and killed them and killed them. I was in so much pain I could barely shoot straight, but I don't think I was even needed. They tried outflanking us, but he laced the jungle with bullets and grenades, and they had to quit. They charged us flat out, but he cut them down one at a time. They sat back and mortared us, but when the smoke cleared, he was still there. He was hit a half dozen times, but all he did was bleed and roar and keep on shooting. He emptied every weapon we had or could take from the dead, and then he beat the last 3 men to death with a rifle butt. I remember looking at him and thinking, what are you? And then there's this panel that just shows a real messed up unknown soldier just firing an AK, and then as the general, and it kind of goes back to him in present day, says war. Yeah. So he's saying, "What are you?" And then he says, "He is war."
And that last panel with the unknown soldier just shooting, he has a little bit of his mask still on
just
him,
a teeny tiny
and kind of peeling off, and that panel really stuck with me because I kind of saw it as symbolism for his humanity just kind of drifting away. I mean, just as the next panel say,
he's got a little ideology left.
Sure. Over time, he's just becoming less of a human and more of a force of nature.
But then you go to the next page, and the soldier says, I have orders to execute anyone who lays eyes on me during a covert operation, but I will not take the life of an American soldier. And he helps him up. And he says, he took me back to Washington, had me assigned to his command. Nominally, I was still with the Corps, but from then on, I was a company man 100%. So, company, of course, is the CIA. And he says, I think he trusted me, he'd seen me in action, knew I didn't scare easily. Clyde says, what is he? Some kind of superhuman assassin? And he says, no. He's 75 years old, Agent Clyde. He's in ultimate human condition. He's been up to his neck in the bloodiest, darkest, most shameful corners of the U.S. foreign policy since 1942. But he is just a man. And then they start talking about, and this is where it starts leading up, everything sort of led up to this, but he mentions, now Anderson, we mentioned earlier that there was somebody that kind of started this whole thing off when Clyde went to the retirement home, that the secretary called and said there's another one. Well, there was somebody named Anderson who had started looking into this and talked to all the same people that Clyde had talked to. And he says Anderson was, this is the general telling Clyde this, he says, Anderson was once a friend of mine. I have no idea how he got the list or saw fit to question the men on it. So we still don't know who gave Clyde the list. And now we know that there was somebody else who was following up the same list, and we don't know who gave him the list either. We know it wasn't this guy who's pulling all the strings now, or we thought was pulling the strings. He called me one night towards the end, almost hysterical, and said he was going to blow the entire thing wide open. He said, I know what happened at Winter Thor. They found his body the next day, but we didn't kill him. And then Clyde says, Winter Thor? And the general says, means nothing to me, it's not on file either. Anderson was buried at Arlington, and then Screwball shoots him, and that's pretty much the end of his visit with that guy. So they go to Arlington, Now, Arlington, I think that the symbolism here is unbelievable because Arlington, of course, was, if you want to talk about the history of an important American landmark, you go back to Arlington. I think, now, Arlington, I think, was at one point owned by Robert E. Lee's wife's family.
Okay.
But obviously, Arlington is Arlington National Cemetery.
Yeah,
and
I was there as a kid. So.
Were you really?
Yeah, and I got to see the ceremony that they did for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which is obviously kind of the idea that that the original Unknown Soldier is kind of based around. And that's actually shown in the first page, which we didn't really talk much about, but we'll get back to that later.
JFK's buried there, I think.
Yeah. I think I saw
that's where they have the eternal flame.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, so they go to Arlington, which is like the kind of the most earnest symbol of American heroism, and they start digging up this Anderson, and Screwball says, "Are you sure this is a good idea?" To which Clyde says, "I'm sure it's an absolutely terrible idea. All I can do is hope Anderson hid something on his body, maybe something to do with this Winter Thor." So it's kind of looking like everything in this story is leading up to whatever Winter Thor was. Mm-hmm. And finding out what Winter Thor was something that drove this Anderson character. It sounds kind of like the knowledge of it drove him nuts. Like it drove him almost insane.
Yeah.
Kind of broke him. Screwball goes back to the car while he's digging up Anderson's grave, and very promptly gets knifed by someone who turns out to be the Unknown Soldier. And that leads to the Unknown Soldier standing over the grave that Clyde is digging up. So now it's finally led up to the whole book's led up to these two meeting, and he's got this sort of this monologue where he says, Clyde, that is, he says, "I'm sorry, Anderson. I thought you could help me. I thought there might be something, but if there was, they found it. I'm sorry." And then he looks up, and the soldier's standing there in the rain. It's pouring rain this whole time, and he's holding a revolver, and he says, "I'm sorry too."
Yeah, and this is just such a great moment. They really use, I mean, for a book called The Unknown Soldier, they really use the titular character sparingly.
Yeah, he's hardly in it.
Yeah, and I mean, there's part of me that's like, come on, I want to see more of him, but it just makes a moment like this at the end.
It's kind of the Jaws effect.
It's right. It's so effective.
We didn't mention about we talked about Killian Plunkett, but the covers were by Tim Bradstreet.
Yes, they were. Who is amazing.
He is great.
Has Bradstreet ever done interiors?
I think I think he has.
Okay.
For what I couldn't tell you though off the top of my head.
All right.
But that's cool. one of the things that really, really, besides using an entire line of dialogue, like Give Me the 60, if you want to compare this to Garth Ennis' Punisher Max run, which also had a character who is, in that run, I think he's 67 or 68.
Okay.
And Frank Castle is about as close to a peak human as you can get, very much like the Unknown Soldier. He's been up to his neck in shit since he was in, Marine Recon and did a bunch of tours in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. The covers were by Tim Bradstreet.
He's great.
Which, yeah, it's very, you can see a definite, I think, influence, and I think Garth Ennis took some of the same ideas from Unknown Soldier and used them in Punisher Max.
Okay, cool. When did Punisher Max start?
Must have been 2000, maybe 2006 or 7.
Okay. We're going to research that, and we're going to take another quick break, but we'll be back with the results of that research. And we are back. What are our search results?
Our search results were Sprecker's Special Amber and Punisher Max by Garth Ennis started coming out in 2004.
Okay.
Let's go back to Unknown Soldier. Mm-hmm. So we've had the climactic meeting between Clyde and the unknown soldier. It's finally happened. And Clyde kind of asked the question that probably was the viewer's perspective, and he says, "Why are we here?" And the soldier says, "Because one man in the right place at the right time can make a difference and win a war. And that's why we're here." So they start talking a little bit, and...
Oh, and by the way...
Yeah.
I did some research, and
Go ahead.
that thing that you just said,
Uh-huh.
that the unknown soldier said, I mean, it's also the first line in the book. That is actually something that... Well, I mean, we don't know who the unknown soldier is,
Mm-hmm.
for sure, in the original series, but it's kind of mentioned. I mean, kind of insinuated that it might be this guy named... I forgot what his name was, but that's something that guy's brother says to him.
Right, I remember.
He dies.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I've got pretty much like the entire original series in the, DC would put out their showcase reprints.
Mm-hmm.
There were sort of the equivalent of Marvel's Essentials, where you had a ton of black and white issues reprinted on newsprint or kind of lower quality paper.
Yeah.
So I've read through chronologically all the Unknown Soldier stuff in that way.
Yeah.
And I know exactly what you're talking about, where they alluded to it could be this guy.
Yeah, and that's kind of cool. I mean, if you do think that it's him, it's just kind of interesting, because that same accident that killed his brother also deformed his face.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting seeing him repeat those words through this whole journey that he has throughout the war, doing this. And just before I forget to mention it, I saw this interesting theory that some people had about the old Unknown Soldier comics, that the Unknown Soldier was actually like the reader of the book. Just because they don't show his face or anything.
Right.
They don't say his name. Like, nobody knows his name except for him. I mean, if he even knows, I don't know what his deal is. But I found that kind of interesting, because back to Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, he was kind of talking about how characters with like less facial features, you're able to kind of project yourself onto them, which is why in like, a lot of anime and stuff, some of the characters might have some more simple facial features, and you kind of project yourself onto them and kind of put yourself in their place. And I just think it's kind of interesting, because he has his face wrapped up in bandages. So, I mean, he could be anyone.
And to your point earlier, they do say, the soldier says, "I lost my face to enemy action, the same action that cost the life of my brother. It was he who told me that one man could make a difference, and only when he had gone did I see the truth in his words."
Mm-hmm.
So
probably is that guy.
It probably is.
Yeah.
But
Eddie Ray.
But he says, and this goes back to what we keep discussing earlier, where he says, "I learned my duty in a place called Dachau in May of 1945. I saw what we were up against. I smelled it. I couldn't get the taste of it out of my mouth for years. It was black, evil, barbaric madness. It was the opposite of everything we stand for, and I knew whatever we did to prevent it happening again was both just and justifiable, because we would be at war with it forever. Such a war is quite simply American destiny, and the very last thing you can afford to be is naive." Now, we've said that we both kind of agree that, and the soldier even says it, that he was really born out of going into that concentration camp and seeing the face of evil, essentially. And he said, the soldier then goes on to say, "I have fought this war for half a century. I've committed unimaginable horrors and was proud to do so for a just and honest cause until they betrayed my war." And he talks about when he went to see a general in his last days. They show a general dying in a bed, and he calls the unknown soldier in to kind of give him his deathbed confession. And he talks about Switzerland, a small airfield, in April 1945. where he met the Nazis. He says this particular group contacted us right after Overlord, dropped all kinds of hints, teased us, if the truth be told, and told us, or we told the Swiss not to give us any shit or a B-17 raid might veer off course. Long story short, he says they met with these Germans, and because what they've been sending, the hints I mean, it was wild stuff. Rockets, bombs, spacecraft, for God's sake, even some kind of biological engineering. For its time, it was phenomenal. We wanted to know the asking price. Now, before we go into what the big reveal here is, this is not something that didn't happen. Operation Paperclip was very real, where the U.S. granted kind of amnesty and asylum to a lot of these German scientists, a lot of the people that, because of, well, and it wasn't just Germans. The Japanese had their own horrible Mengele-style experimental camps like Unit 731. And a lot of these people were given kind of a blanket amnesty because the information that and research that they conducted, both on people and technologically, was extremely in demand. It was kind of an arms race, even back then, to beat the Soviets to this knowledge, to this information. And so Paperclip, there were a lot of people that were given amnesty that had done horrible things, that had done things to prop up the Nazi regime, and it's a very real instance. So this is not, what he's about to reveal is not reaching. But these Nazis that they're meeting with, he says they wanted to know the asking price. Well, the Nazi says we would like to relocate. Any part of South America would be acceptable. A small select group would go first, with the facility for others to join us if they can make their way. The U.S. may supervise our activities to whatever extent they see fit. In fact, we wholeheartedly welcome your participation. And now it shows these kind of company men, these American officers, this general, and they say, go on. And then the German says, we will order the immediate surrender of all German-held territories to American forces. Our armies in the east will continue to resist the Soviets until you can reach out and occupy our positions. And they ask, the Americans say, and the research data, he says, will be yours. They knew just what to say. We wanted to piss all over the Ivans, so the Russians, as soon as we got through Germany, and they knew it. Now, the experimental stuff they'd sent through up till then, it'd just be tidbits. We showed it to the backroom boys. They said, sure, this could work, but we don't know how to build it. Then it goes back to the flashback, and the German guys are telling the Americans, let me tell you exactly what we can do for you. A nuke that could have tripled the death toll at Hiroshima, a missile, not an aircraft that could deliver it, like intercontinental ballistic missiles, which the Germans had been working on. Soldiers incapable of feeling pain, remorse, or doubt, born of the research conducted in the camps. Scientifically, Germany is years ahead. We lack only resources, which I am told the United States is never short of. If you like, we can show you how to put an American on the moon by 1945. Or 1949. And the general, making his confession to the unknown soldier, said, those were the heady days. I just got my 3rd star, kept hearing people call me brilliant, dashing, a risk taker. I'd already gotten used to deciding the destinies of thousands. South America, sure. It's doable. And the Nazis say, well, we have one other condition. And then one of them slides a picture across the table and says, he comes too. And the picture is that of the leader of the National Socialist Party, Adolf Hitler.
And that's just such an oh shit moment.
It absolutely is.
It's great.
And then it shows basically everybody's reaction. It shows this young general making the confession, his reaction, the unknown soldier's silent reaction, Clyde's silent reaction.
Which I didn't even realize. I mean, it takes place like through 3 different points in time,
right,
too.
Exactly. And then it shows
wonderful. And they're all silent, too.
Yeah, everybody is. The Americans fantastic. Are just silent, and then it cuts to the Germans, and they're just silent. And remember that they say that earlier, after this, they want to go to South America, they say it's doable. So now they propose this, and then the same guy says, well, like I say, it's doable. Then it goes back to the deathbed confession of this general who says, I remember staring into hell. I heard myself say yes. Saw my hand shake the Nazis. A part of me would not acknowledge the nightmare of what I was doing. And that's how you make a pact with Satan. So you're thinking, reading this, holy shit, now, obviously a lot of these guys got out to South America. Eichmann got out, and the Israelis with the Wiesenthal Center, they ended up getting him and trying him. Okay. But guys like, Mengele got out, and he died in like 1977 in Brazil. A lot of these guys got out. So some of the worst of these sons of bitches got out and lived and died of old age in South America. It's not out of the realm of possibility. Mm-hmm. But it's like a whole other... It's a completely different thing to think that in this story, you have the unknown soldier whose entire worldview was shaped by what he saw in the concentration camps. And now he finds out that the country and the people that he had worked for agreed to trade the life of Hitler and all these worst of the worst officers and scientists for some research data. Betrayed him in his war. Well, it's not so fast, because the general says, but we've been greedy and we hadn't bothered telling London about the Winterthur meeting. If we had, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, would have canceled all patrols along the Swiss-German border that night. If not for a night fighter's chance encounter, a clandestine Fourth Reich would have been established in Colombia under Adolf Hitler with the full backing of the USA. So it didn't end up happening, but the fact of the matter is they had agreed to it. And it cuts back to Clyde asking the unknown soldier. He says, they genuinely could have done it. How high did it go? And the soldier says, I don't know. By then I'd heard enough. And it shows the soldier so pissed off that he takes a pillow and smothers this old general to death in his bed. Mm-hmm. And he says, in the last months of the war, I'd reported to him directly the betrayal was personal. So imagine that you're him, and you find out that this guy who is your superior and everything you fought for was completely betrayed. How would that screw up your worldview?
Yeah.
I just thought that there's the whole story, and that's why, again, I said in 10 years you wouldn't be able to tell a story like this, because what more ultimate evil can you think of for your own government to conduct than agreeing to let Adolf Hitler go free? At the end of the war. It's like, it doesn't get worse than that. It's like it is the ultimate evil, the ultimate betrayal. And it was in there. And that's something that you could see how that would completely change. Like Anderson, the guy who had been following up before Clyde, how discovering that bit of information would just drive him nuts. I mean, I can totally get that in the context of this story.
Mm-hmm. And with him strangling that guy with a pillow, I think that reveals a lot about the soldier, because before that you kind of see him as some guy who's willing to follow orders no matter what.
Absolutely.
But with that,
but there were still caveats. Like, he was supposed to kill anyone who saw him in action. But that guy in Vietnam, he wouldn't kill an American soldier.
Yeah.
But now this general is not just an American soldier, but an American general. Uh-huh. But he kills him straight out.
Yeah. You definitely realize that, he's not taking orders from anybody. He has his own agenda that just seemed to line up with other people's, with the government's orders and stuff.
And this is it. Now, he references, Clyde says, they still brought some of the top men out, don't you? And the soldier says, it's common knowledge von Braun and his rockets and a few other members. So, and those were a lot of the people that were granted, that were gotten out during Paperclip. If you want to do some research into Operation Paperclip or Unit 731, go right ahead. It will piss you off.
I know who von Braun is because I've read Manhattan Projects.
Hey, there
which
you
is
go.
100% accurate.
Is it really? That's interesting.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Hickman did some serious research for that.
Hickman must have had access to my library in the living room there.
Yeah. Him working with Manhattan Projects and everything.
Yeah, naturally. But then Clyde says they were Nazis, the same breed of little dictator we've been setting up all over the world ever since. How can you justify all that to yourself and still call what happened at Winter Thor a betrayal? And I just think that this whole last issue, there are some flashbacks, but the entire issue is Clyde and the Unknown Soldier sitting on top of an open grave in the rain in a graveyard having a conversation. You think about that from a storytelling perspective, that is the entire issue.
Yeah. A lot of this series is a lot of just talking and dialogue, and you really have to give Killian Plunkett some credit because it is really, really hard to make that work in comic books.
Yeah.
I mean, and Garth Ennis some credit, just because, I mean, comic books are all about action and stuff going on, and even though you just have people around talking, Plunkett gives you different angles and just really detailed expressions on the character's face. And this actually just came to me, but this last issue, kind of reminds me of the last issue of Grant Morrison's Animal Man, where Animal
it's just
Man,
him talking to Grant Morrison?
Yeah, it's just him talking to the guy who's been pulling the strings of his life.
I can totally see that.
I mean, it's the same idea, basically.
Well, so the gist of their conversation now, and remember that this whole thing was started with Clyde getting these random names put on his computer to investigate, and Anderson prior to him. Up till this point, we have no idea who put those names on his computer, but we know it wasn't the guy that Screwball shot. We know it certainly wasn't Screwball, and it wasn't the CIA. Well, this is where the soldier says, when... First off, I just want to read this little bit of dialogue because I thought it was really good. Where he says, this was talking about Hitler, this is the monster, the beast himself, the architect of everything we had to fight against, and they were going to save him. For the men who oversaw his downfall to then engineer his escape would have made the war, everything I fought for, utterly worthless, and that miserable dying wretch in his traitor's bed knew it too. So I think that him smothering that general as he lay dying in that bed, for him, he knew that the entire time that he reported to that guy, that he knew that it was all a farce. You know, that they weren't doing it for this idea and ideology that the soldier had. It was for the co-opted America, if that makes sense, you know?
Yeah.
But anyway, so it jumps to answering that question that we just asked, where Clyde says, I think it's time you told me what you've done. And he says that the soldier says it would take a lifetime to tell. Because that's what it is, a lifetime spent groping in the guts of horror, up to my elbows, committing atrocity to order. And 5 years ago discovering Winter Thor, knowing at last that the regime that gave me those orders was tainted, and knowing that I could not in all conscience continue my work, I have chosen my replacement. Who would be, in his mind, it's Clyde.
Oh my gosh.
Soldiers,
Yeah.
And the soldier says, I decided you should know the reality of the world you'll have to enter. I wanted you to follow my trail through the accounts you'd hear to confirm to me that your skills were equal to the task, and to commit yourself to the point of no return. More than anything, I had to start you down the trail without Colonel Booth suspecting my involvement. And he said so he had to sacrifice everyone that knew about him, so Clyde could find out what the soldier was. And then he brings up Anderson, who was Clyde's predecessor in investigating the unknown soldier. And the soldier says, no, Anderson was different. He excelled with the 101st just as you did with Special Forces. He went on to join the CIA, had no friends and family left to speak of. He remained an American soldier first and foremost. He followed every order to the letter, no matter how far into darkness he was sent, and yet never let himself be used as some administrator's thug. His dedication to duty never wavered, just like you. He was my first choice, and I killed him because he discovered Winter Thor. The betrayal I felt over that affair had destroyed my will to go on. I resolved that whoever replaced me would never know the truth. But the agent who accompanied the general to Winter Thor was still alive. The specter of Winter Thor had never left him. When he read about the general's unexplained suffocation, he alone realized the truth. So basically, he contacted Anderson, begged for protection in exchange for everything he knew about me, particularly why he thought I'd want to kill him. So the soldier killed Anderson because he found out about Winter Thor. Mm-hmm. And then Clyde says, so you're going to kill me too? And the soldier says, no, I'm not. He says, this was never how things were supposed to work out. Either for you or Anderson, Winter Thor was meant to remain a secret. You would take my place. And Clyde says, and do what exactly? And the soldier says, you would have learned the nature of the war I fight. You would have understood me and the need for me. And he says, before you protest, think. You have no friends or family, a fact I made sure of when I chose you. Even if your pursuing me hadn't destroyed your career, linked you to death after death, made you a marked man, you have no life to go back to. This one certainty in your existence is that you're sitting in a grave on the body of a dead man. And this is a master of dialogue, I've always thought.
Yeah.
And he says he kind of explains more, but he says there must be a soldier. And then Clyde says, and who are the enemy? And the soldier says, those who oppose the American will. The crimes I spoke of, the genocide I witnessed in the camps, ultimately we are always right and everything we do is right. This is my legacy to you as an American soldier. And then Clyde says, did you ever stop to ask yourself if I want to work with you? I've never come to believe I was a crusader in a holy war. I'm here, and then the soldier says, and this is where it gets, everything kind of goes full circle. He says, you cannot escape from this. You cannot run from this place I'd led you to. You cannot hide from me. You are here because you know what must be done. And Clyde says, you think so? I think I'm here because a beautiful woman smiled at me.
Yeah, that moment was just crazy.
And then he kind of goes on and explains why. And I'm not going to read it because I think it's something that's better left to someone to read the book.
Absolutely.
But Clyde ends up, I mean, for one of the first times in the book, he's kind of smiling, even though he's talking to the soldier, and he kind of realizes what's going on. And I just want to end with, he says, when a woman smiles at you like that, there's a promise in it, but more than that, there's a warmth between the two of you. It made me think, here is something that's good in the world. Then he pulls out a gun and starts holding it to his head, and the soldier keeps yelling at him that he has to do this, and Clyde just says, why? And he says, you have to be the soldier. He yells, because I can't do it anymore. So he's pretty much, the soldier has been overwhelmed with everything that he's done and realizing that he hasn't done it for the reason that he thought he was doing it. Yeah. And all that horrible things he's done has been for kind of a lie. Go ahead.
It's always a cathartic moment when you see someone who's portrayed as this cold-blooded or, just really strong character just completely break down.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm sure someday I'll figure out the words to explain why it's just so brilliant. He explains it in such a great way that as horrid as what he found out Winter Thor was, you could see why it would drive someone like him completely insane, because he had done this stuff. He only found out about Winter Thor 5 years ago. Yeah. He had done all of this stuff in between, these horrible atrocities, but he did it believing he was doing it for the right reason. Yeah. He just finds out that his entire existence, pretty much, was a complete and total lie. And he had done these things, and that which he had believed in was false. And earlier in the book, we'd mentioned the figment of his imagination, Wallace, who kept saying, I'm trying to explain to him that she's obviously a figment of his imagination because he doesn't even know her first name. Or middle name, I think.
Or is it middle name? Yeah, middle name. Yeah. And he holds a gun to his head and he says, Jane. J was for Jane. And shoots himself.
What do you think that moment means exactly?
Him knowing that it was Jane. Like, was she a ghost, or was she just a figment of his imagination?
I'm not sure how to interpret that exact moment.
I guess I've always taken it as that he just knew, maybe he knew a little bit more about her than he was letting on.
Okay.
You know, maybe it was
Yeah.
something where he did a lot. He was interested in her too,
Mm.
or maybe she was. I don't know. I really don't know, but I think it works.
Yeah.
Because even if he is nuts and he was just completely imagining her, we don't know that her name that the J stood for Jane. But if he thinks so, and he thinks that combined with her smile is enough to justify him not wanting the soldier to wash his legacy of blood off onto Clyde, then it's worth doing. You know,
Absolutely.
then that's worth it.
Yeah. I mean, while I was reading this, I didn't even get the impression that it might have been some sort of ghost or anything.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that it was just all just his conscience and that it was just all in his head. But that's a very interesting way of. I mean, it almost makes it more interesting just thinking that it could be one way or the other.
Yeah. I think that's why he left it like that, too.
Yeah, yeah.
But then the last, there's only 3 pages left of the book afterwards, and the last 2 of them are, it's for the first time really you see the soldier during daylight hours, out in the sun and standing over Arlington, and he's just looking down on this ambulance that is where a couple of people are talking about how they found 2 bodies in this grave, and somebody dropped white phosphorus in that burned the bodies down to being unrecognizable. And the soldier says he is an American soldier known but to God, and he rests in honored glory. And then the last big splash page is him just standing at the flagpole, kind of leaning up against it, totally broken, and he says, "God damn me."
Yeah, and this is just amazing because we didn't really talk about the first couple pages, but like the very first couple pages of the story are him at night at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington, and he's looking up at the flagpole, kind of keeping his distance, and he just says, "I need it to be true just one last time."
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of him just searching for hope, and just the contrast of this in the very last scene, kind of it being daytime, because he's kind of fooling himself in a way, I think, to look at Clyde, someone who represents these old American ideals, to replace him, and I think some part of him just looks forward to a better tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, morning kind of signifies, a brand new start, and it's.
But he's not getting that.
No, he's not, and it's kind of beautiful because I just feel like symbolically, this bright setting has it's supposed to show so much promise, and he's there, and he's even closer to the flagpole, and he's even leaning on it, like he is bound to this country for life, whether he likes it or not, and he's so hypocritical in that last scene, because he wants Clyde to take it over because he can't handle the stress anymore. Right. Even though, he doesn't even believe the ideals anymore, but by giving it to someone else and by running away from it.
I think that my takeaway from it was that he still does believe in what America stands for. I think he believes that, but I think the problem is that he doesn't believe any of the people that are that represent America. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Where the flag, what America is, the ideology of we want to do what's right, and we want to help the little guy and protect the people that can't protect themselves, has been for decades and decades and decades, has been co-opted. And I think the fact that the CIA is the main player in here is that it was by design, and you've got your economic hitmen to borrow the title of a bestseller, that have been doing regime change. They have Iran in here. Obviously, it doesn't always work out the way that they want it to work out. But I think that I view the soldier as somebody who still believes in America, but he just doesn't believe in the people running America.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and
that makes sense.
And he doesn't. And Clyde was a guy who believed in America so much that he didn't want to let himself be corrupted like the soldier was. He just would rather end it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said this before, but he's very stuck in these like World War II American ideals. You know, he believes in. I mean, he is the embodiment of the American dream, and I mean, in this story, you just realize that the American dream just isn't fit for this country anymore, and he just literally just shoots himself in the head.
Or I don't know, but or is it? I mean, if you're because both him and the soldier were guys that were products of the people that were doing the heinous shit around the country or around the world. I think that the American dream still exists for most people. I mean, we're sitting in beautiful Oconomowoc in my 3-season room drinking beer.
Yeah, I mean, we're
talking about comic books.
We're
you know
pretty
what I mean?
well off.
But I think that anyone who does the same that kind of work that those guys do, it's gonna be hard not to be cynical and jaded and have that same worldview and viewpoint.
I don't think the Unknown Soldier was quite at the level of innocence that Clyde was at, but I mean, there's also a point you can make that the Unknown Soldier is the American dream, and just that he's changing with the times, and that it's just not what it used to be.
Well, it's kind of like is that the opening scene of Blue Velvet, the David Lynch movie, where
I just know that one line that Kevin Smith uses.
I don't know. But I think it's been a while since I've seen it, but I think the opening scene where it shows like this beautiful suburb and this beautiful green grass, this well manicured lawn, but then it goes a little bit deeper and deeper, and there's worms underneath and dark shit and a severed finger or something, and underneath every beautiful facade there tends to be something dark, and I think our country is no different, regardless of who is in charge, and certainly back, again, in the 90s when you look at what was going on with everything from, the stuff that started because of Ruby Ridge and the militia movement, and but then you had Waco, and you had all this stuff where, like, everybody on both sides was terrified of government, and they were terrified of the people responding to that fear of government. Okay. And I think this book was born out of that, and I think it was born out of the stuff that a lot of these agencies have been doing, these regime changes and things where you go, how does that really benefit America? Does it benefit the people pulling the strings? And the Unknown Soldier being a guy who's stuck in between both of those. He loves America. He wants America to be the shining city on the hill, but how can it be with so much dark, heinous shit? Yeah, I don't know. It's something that just I first probably read this book 20 years ago. Because I know I bought it in single issues, and it
came out 20 years ago.
It did. That's right.
Exactly,
it came out
20 years ago.
Exactly. And back then, I would say it had more of an impact on me than it did now, just because of what was going on. But it still is. I don't know. I think it's just such a well-made. It's a powerful book.
Absolutely, yeah. And that just kind of made something come to my mind. Like most historical things, I mean, war or just any international conflict, I mean, you can kind of see both sides to it. And I mean, I've never been so much of a I've never really been into, war history and stuff. I should really brush up on it, but
I know where you could.
yes. I think that's part of why people are so interested in World War II, just because it makes so much sense.
Mm-hmm.
You don't think about World War II and you're like, well, I mean, should we have done that to the Nazis?
Well, I don't. You know what though? When I was in, and again, my grandpa was in the Pacific.
Okay.
I had some family friends that were in the Pacific. One of my friend's great uncles was in the Pacific, and he was a great guy. And I was lucky enough to grow up hearing firsthand accounts of World War II, and my grandpa spent 4 years in the Pacific, and I have all my grandpa's decorations. I have all of my. But I mean, my brother and I were really, really, really lucky guys. And I remember when I was talking to one of my friend's great uncles, a guy named Delbert, who passed away a couple of years ago. But he was in his 90s. And Delbert was just an incredible guy, but he was one of the first people he was in the Army. And he was going to be on one of the first ships that was going to land, or that was going to hit the beachhead, mainland Tokyo. And that was back in 1945, and they knew that if they did an invasion of Tokyo, that they were going to. He told me. He said we all just were for 3 days. We were on this ship knowing that we were going to die, because at that point, and it, not just die, but have to do horrible things before they died. Because you got to remember that most of the people that were left in Tokyo were old people, women, and children in mainland Japan. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of the soldiers had been killed, the military-age males. And so he told me, he said, we knew we would either be killing women and children with bamboo spears, or we would get killed right away. There's no doubt about it, because of the mindset that they had. They were going to die for their emperor. And he told me that the best news that he ever got, waiting on this ship to have to go in to invade mainland Japan, was that they had dropped the first bomb, and that changed everything. And I remember when I was in high school, we won't really shy away from controversy in this podcast.
Yeah.
I remember having a teacher that was talking about how, it just, looking back, do you think maybe we shouldn't have dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and on Nagasaki? And she was not, like nobody else cared, but I said, absolutely not. I said, first off, it ended the war quicker, it saved American lives, and it saved more Japanese lives. It really did. But it's kind of a revisionist history that's being taught now, where we go, well, it wasn't that humane of a thing. Maybe we shouldn't have done it. Well, how can you go back and judge something like that? Mm-hmm. that happened 72 years ago, that saved American lives and honestly helped expedite the Japanese surrender and save Japanese lives too. It was a horrible thing.
It's honestly it's really hard to tell what would have happened if we hadn't.
Mm-hmm. But either way, it had to happen, and now it's easy to sit back and kind of armchair general and say, well, we shouldn't have done that. But it's horrible too. I mean, I have right in the next room, I have a bunch of books written by Japanese survivors about the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they're horrible things to live through. But I don't think it's the right of anyone that wasn't involved in it to sit back and say, should we have done that? Maybe we shouldn't have. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of thing carries over to stories like this, where we go, is that the type of thing we want to judge a character like the Unknown Soldier on? What was his motivation at the time?
The story deals with a lot of things that are mm-hmm. morally ambiguous, and they might be wrong, but they might have led to a better outcome.
Yeah.
And you just see that kind of becoming more common as the years go by. And
yeah, like I said, we did. There's both sides of the spectrum, and we did horrible shit in a lot of different conflicts that we were in. You know, and there's no doubt about it. We did regime changes that we had no place doing, and but at the same time, if you believe in what America represents, like the Unknown Soldier does, you can justify that, even if it is completely and utterly wrong and kind of atrocious to do. I think Clyde was the guy who just still believed in it and knew that if he followed through with what the soldier did, that he would no longer believe in it. And I think he would rather have died believing that than lived on and have that corrupted.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Mm-hmm. Something that I noticed in here, I don't even know if you noticed.
Ooh, hit me.
But in the first pages, when you see the Unknown Soldier at night, you see him in this coat.
Mm-hmm.
And once Clyde goes to meet Markowitz, you see him pretty much wearing the same exact coat. And he wears that throughout the entire
I didn't notice
story.
that.
And I found that so interesting because, I mean, it looks like the same exact coat. And he's wearing it wherever he goes.
It looks like a trench coat.
Yeah. But, you know, it's got that flap in the back. I mean, I'm not a trench coat expert. I don't know if all of them have that.
You're not?
I'm not.
Oh, man.
No, I don't even own one trench coat. Yeah, I'm a flannel guy, so flannel and skinny jeans. But, yeah, I just found that really interesting. I don't know if that was meant to be like a subconscious thing, but, I mean, just looking back at the story a second time, or a third time in this case, it's just kind of interesting seeing the cues that he's kind of. I mean, it's kind of showing him descending into the path of the new Unknown Soldier, even though he doesn't end up going that way anyway.
And then veering away at the end.
Yeah, and that's just why that moment at the end is great, because a girl smiled at me. It's just the Unknown Soldier thinks that he has Clyde figured out, but he's just doing it because at one point in his life he felt like he wasn't alone.
Yeah,
and I'm pretty sure if I thought a couple days, I could think of some other analysis of that. But
I think we're in agreement that it's a great book.
Yeah, it is fantastic. I probably wouldn't have read this if you hadn't chose it. So
well, I'm glad I did.
Yeah.
No, that's what I like getting out of a book, is being able to sit and have 4 hours of conversation about something, because I love to. I think it's even better when you can something like this that is so. You could take completely different viewpoints away from reading this book. You know, you could. I mean, completely different viewpoints from it.
There's a lot opener,
and I think that is what makes it so good. But the other thing, being such an Ennis fan, I think that Ennis is the best dialogue writer in comics. And I was going to throw this one at you. Now everybody likes to talk about Bendis and Bendis' dialogue. Do you think where do you rank Bendis?
I would put Bendis under Garth Ennis with dialogue. You see, I think my first impression of Garth Ennis was with Preacher, which, by the way, I haven't even finished. Okay. Which I really need to finish.
You do.
And I mean, it is written wonderfully, but it's very vulgar. So I kind of associate that with Garth Ennis.
So do you? But what I talked about before with the kind of the different Ennises.
Yeah.
Do you prefer something like this, the more like earnest Ennis, to the arseface kind of crude, vulgar humor Ennis?
I mean,
or do you like a little of both?
Preacher did it in moderation that I think was perfect. I mean, it really depends on the story. I think this was perfect for this story. Preacher just had its great dark humor when it needed it. But I mean, I really don't know if I've read much Ennis, but just this really shows me. I mean, there's some fucks and stuff every once in a while, but just it really shows you how well of a writer he is with dialogue. I mean, I definitely agree he's up there. I might put Warren Ellis up with him, just because I'm a pretty big Warren Ellis fan. I have a tattoo of one of his books.
You do nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. But yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, everything is. I was kind of mentioning Plunkett's details with the art that make it that still make it interesting to read, even though there's just a lot of just talking scenes. I think a lot of that also has to do with just how believable the dialogue is. It doesn't sound like you're just reading words. Like, I mean, he knows how people talk.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, yeah.
No, his best stuff is always like that, too, where you get done reading and it doesn't feel like you've just read a book or a comic. It feels like you have just heard a conversation.
Mm-hmm. Seen some really good movie or something.
That, too.
Yeah.
That, too. What would this... So having read this, does this lead you to want to read more Ennis or look at more Plunkett, or what does it make you want to follow it up with?
It doesn't sound like I have much to do with Plunkett, so that's not really an option. But I definitely want to read more Garth Ennis, and I mean, honestly, I wouldn't really call this a war story. Mm-hmm. It has kind of parts of war put in there, but I mean...
It's an espionage book more than anything.
Yeah, I mean... War stories haven't really interested me that much. I don't know why exactly, but I mean, it's definitely opened up my mind. Like, I really want to read stuff like Enemy Ace and stuff like that. I mean, yeah. I haven't really read much war stuff at all, but excellent. I would like to check it out now.
Yeah, that's why Ennis is so great. His body of work covers so many different things. But again, I think something like this or war stories, if you are... I've had a lot of people where I've recommended Ennis to them and they've said, well, I've tried Preacher and it's a little too... Yeah, and it's a little too over the top. His stuff is not always like that.
Oh, no, absolutely not.
Even though I like
this
both of it. Yeah.
Great testament to that.
Yeah, exactly. This would be something that... This is a movie that I could have... Or a book that I could have seen like Jonathan Demme making a kind of a gritty Silence of the Lambs looking movie out of or something, where it's just you can see every little bit of grit and dirt in every panel, and everything rings so true about it.
He has such range. I mean, he can do ridiculous stuff like Six Pack and Dog Welder, where they literally weld like two stars together that are named after dogs, or Yeah, you have a character that welds dogs to people's faces. Like,
I don't know if his heart was really into that one.
And then you can. He returned to those characters. I'm sure. Mm-hmm. I'm sure he's at least into it or getting a kick out of it. But then you can read like just completely serious stuff like this, and it's
heavy,
fantastic.
I mean, look at the kind of stuff we talked about from reading it.
Absolutely,
crazy.
We talked about it for over 2 hours now.
Good Lord!
I know, and I'm not even bored.
Wow, it's amazing.
Yeah, are you bored?
No, not at all.
That's good.
I've got Garth Ennis and beer.
That's all you need in life.
I know.
Maybe some food. I don't know.
Nah, I'm good.
Protein.
I'm good.
Okay. Cool. You have any finishing thoughts on
I really... my only finishing thoughts would be if you are at all interested in anything having to do with military history, read Unknown Soldier. If you like Garth Ennis and you have not yet read Unknown Soldier, read Unknown Soldier. If you like the original Unknown Soldier, read Unknown Soldier. Just read Unknown Soldier. I mean, if you've listened to us talk, read Unknown Soldier. And if you have... Do you have an email set up for correspondence for this podcast?
Not for this podcast.
Okay.
Not necessarily, but I do have a professional email. It's clintstout@gmail.com. So, I mean, people can come to me with it. Or they can just go to the show's Twitter, which I have, which I'll mention later.
That works. If you listen to it, you like it, you have a follow-up question or comment, email or tweet.
Tweet?
Tweet.
Tweet
I don't
sounds
use
too dirty.
I don't use the Twitter.
Yeah.
Email or tweet Clint if you need some good recommendations or some World War II books. You can email or tweet Clint, and I will let you know. If you disagree with anything we've said, also let us know. We are not strangers to
Absolutely.
for sure. So
I want to be criticized because that encourages me to be a better person.
Heck yeah.
And fill in the gaps of my knowledge and creativity and all that.
And you know what? Do you have anybody lined up for the next one yet?
I do not have any lined up. Well, actually, I do.
Oh,
His name is James.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have you lined up for the next one.
Okay. But I'm not. But I'm just a guest.
Yeah, you're just a guest.
On the Clint cast.
You're important, but
Oh, thank you.
you'll fill in some gaps here and there.
Okay,
But
okay.
But
I'll
have
tell you
some
what.
other people on too.
As a guest, what I'm looking forward to hearing are, because despite having a comic book store, I've read 1% of the comics that are out there, and I am looking forward to hearing you and your further guests discussing books that I need to read, why they're so good.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a neat idea. I think it's a really cool idea for a podcast, and I am looking forward to hearing more. And if anyone has any ideas for Clint about books that he should read, or if you happen to be somebody who, would you take a Skype guest?
I mean, maybe. I'd be open to it.
It's an option.
Yeah.
Contact Clint.
Contact me.
Email him. Tweet him.
Absolutely. I'm definitely interested in getting some more creators on here, big and small. So yeah. Awesome.
You want to call it?
Absolutely. You can find the show on Twitter at Comics That Work, and you can just go on there to figure out what book we're talking about the next episode, which will probably be in about 2 weeks. We'll see where it goes. But yeah, you're going to want to keep up on that so you can read it before we spoil it for you. And you can also follow me at Clint Stout. I'm just going to talk about whatever I feel like talking about on there. So I can't promise you it's going to be quality. And James, anything you want to plug? Store's website, anything?
You know what? I've already done my plugs.
All right. Well,
I'm not going to co-opt your podcast anymore.
I'm just going to say you should search Kowabunga Comics.
Oh, well, thank you.
In Oconomowoc, Wisconsin.
Co-op.
I think it's kowabungacomics.com.
It is. Or check out, or listen to the podcast.
Yeah, Cowcast.
The Cowcast, where we talk about, where I do not talk about things like this. We talk about industry things.
I mean, it definitely sets itself apart from other comic podcasts.
Well, thank you.
Because it goes
thank
into
you very much.
Goes into the what's it like to own a comic store and all the business side of that. And you don't see that in anything. You don't see that in iFanboy or any of the other comic podcasts coming out. So.
Well, thank you for the plug. I appreciate it. And thank you more
absolutely.
than anything for having me on your inaugural episode.
No problem. Thank you for being here.
Oh, of course.
I mean, I couldn't get anyone else on.
Hey, well, it is my house. Where else would I be?
Yeah, that's a good point. But where else would I be? Not at
right
your
here.
house.
Well, true.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Let's do it.
Awesome. Thank you for listening. Happy reading.